we're going to start the day with our keynote speaker from another sort of important speaker that is going to represent a lot of experience with the National Committee on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, a very strong woman. And I would like to ask her to come up now, Ms. Karine Duhamel.
Hello, everybody. Bonjour. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to start by acknowledging, of course, Elder Pelletier. Thank you for the opening prayer, and to the drummers as well. It is really nice to open this gathering with song and with language, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I know that, when we stand in spaces like this one, which is a really beautiful space, but we hear it filled with Indigenous languages and Indigenous voices, it is really, it's really touching, and so I'm really happy to be here today. Sorry. So my name is Karine Duhamel. I am a member of Red Rock First Nation. I also have ties to the Métis community here in Manitoba and also in Ontario. I grew up here in Winnipeg, and I've lived here almost my whole life, and I still live here now. I've tried to leave a few times, and I keep coming back, actually. I am involved in this issue because I am a historian, I'm an Indigenous scholar, and I worked as Director of Research for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And so I'm often asked to come and talk about that work, but the invitation that I got today was also, I thought, a really good opportunity to look at what's gone on in the last 3 years and to think about what should come next. I too have the same kind of feelings around territorial acknowledgement as you do, but I do, before I get into it, want to acknowledge the 5 women who've lost their lives in Winnipeg over the last few weeks, and just to acknowledge their family members and the people who love them. So I just want to make sure that my little clicky, it does work. Okay, so the purpose of today's talk is really to reflect on what's happened in the last 3 years, reflect on what's gone wrong, and also to reflect on what's gone right. I think it's really necessary always to recenter the voices of family members and survivors, many of whom are here today, and who will be talking to us over the next few days, because I can tell you that I spent a really long time in school, but I learned more in the year that I spent with families and survivors and with the National Inquiry than I did in 12 years of university. And so I really want to emphasize that what I'm sharing today is really my experience, but it represents what I learned from families and survivors, and those are the folks that we need to be listening to more than anyone else. I'm really honored to learn from them. And I think that families and survivors are the real experts. They're the people that need or that know what needs to happen next and where we should focus our efforts to confront violence. So to begin, I want to take a quick look back. How did we get here historically in the context of the inquiry? But then I also want to look at where we are today. What are the root causes? Have we made any progress in confronting the root causes? I want to note where progress has been made, but I also want to reflect on the work that still needs to be done. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about how we might go about thinking about creating a real paradigm shift, really changing what is happening without just applying Band-Aid solutions, but actually thinking about transforming society and how do we approach that and what are some of the things that we can do to think about that. How can we make sure that the world that we are creating for our children and our grandchildren is one in which Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQI+ people, and indeed all people are safe? So I put up this slide because this is one of the things that we heard during the inquiry that really touched me. This idea that somebody shared with us. I feel like my spirit knows violence, Many among you will no doubt recognize The Scream, a painting created by Kent Monkman in 2017. And I like to show this one because I feel like it really encapsulates, as a historian, so many of the things that we hear about. But when we talk about history, people often focus on events, on these things that happen at a particular point in time, and far less people think about the structure under which those events occur, the structure that continues to animate much of the violence that we see today. And so this idea, I feel like my spirit knows violence, I think speaks to many of the experiences that people shared. The histories not only of their own lives, but of their ancestors, of the grandparents, of the great-grandparents, of the people who have been here since time immemorial and who have lived in successive generations only to inherit the violence of previous generations. And so this idea of a spirit knowing violence really speaks to me because of the way that so many people that shared with the National Inquiry and who have shared with me since have talked about this issue. I think that when we think about violence, then we have to look sort of beyond these events, sort of beyond a small time period. We're often hearing about the crisis of MMIWG, and indeed it is a crisis in terms of its proportions. But what sometimes bothers me about crisis, the language of crisis, is that sometimes when people hear crisis, they hear something really small, and this is really, really big. And it's not something that's new, and it's not something that's just happened. It's something that has happened, that's been happening for a really long time. And so we can talk about a crisis in terms of the impact of those who have been taken, but we have to think beyond a crisis to think about how we actually change systems. So for those of you that don't, I know many of you are very familiar with this, and so I won't take a long time, but just to kind of recall and to sort of set the stage for what we're thinking about soon, many of you no doubt know that the National Inquiry came to be because of the advocacy of family members and survivors, because of decades of advocacy by people who maintained that there was something to see here, there was something to investigate, that it wasn't just the case of one person in one place or a particular circumstance, but it was a bigger, a systemic issue that needed to be solved. It was also the result of many survivors of residential schools speaking out about the violence in their own families over generations. And so when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada published their report in 2015 and their calls to action, they called for a national inquiry to be created to look into the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The National Inquiry is the first truly national inquiry of its kind that has ever occurred in Canada, and I say that because it's technically quite true. The National Inquiry was 14 concurrent inquiries at the same time, so there was one national kind of federal inquiry. And there was also one inquiry going on at the same time in every province and territory. What this allowed us to do was to subpoena evidence from all the different jurisdictions, understanding that the systems and the institutions that target Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people and families don't just come from the federal government and don't just come from Ottawa, but they come in provinces, they come in territories, they come through education, they come through health, they come through child welfare. And so we really wanted to be able to look at the issue in a really broad and a really holistic way. The inquiry was really broad. It asked us to look into the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including the social, the economic, the cultural, the institutional, and the historical underlying causes. And it asked us to do it without a start or an end date, or without kind of a geographic limit, right? And so in doing so, it created a tremendous challenge in terms of deciding what we were going to look at, but also a real opportunity in thinking about things in a way that was more holistic and more complete than we usually get to do in inquiries. Often, because inquiries are limited with a start or an end or with a particular geography, it means that you can't actually look beyond. You can't actually look at the history. You can't take a long view, right? And it's really important to take a long view on anything colonial, but in particular on the issue of MMIWG. And so in that way, it really allowed us the freedom to approach these stories in a different way, to look at them for what they were, expressions not just of somebody's life, but of successive generations of racism, of discrimination, and of genocide. And so the inquiry's mandate was the opportunity, and then commissioners also wanted to make sure that we tried to include as many people as possible, and so opened it up to look at issues impacting, in particular, to us LGBTQI+ people, and also wanted to include families of the heart, because of so many people that we heard about who had talked about creating new communities, right? Wherever you go, and this was my experience with the NI, wherever I traveled to, wherever I went, everywhere I went, people were so welcoming, and they were willing to kind of extend community in all of these cases. And so for us, as the National Inquiry, it was really important to celebrate kind of our family and to make sure that we were looking at all of the things that family members and survivors told us was important. And that really went beyond a very limited kind of mandate. Of course, we didn't do this work alone. And along the way, we walked with family members and survivors, and grandmothers and knowledge keepers, so that we could better understand what we needed to do. The National Family Advisory Circle was one of those really key groups of people who was composed of family members from across the country and survivors from across the country, all of whom really made sure that they kept us honest, they kept us on the right track. And so I do want to play a very short video introducing you to some of those family members, but I do want to give you a bit of a heads up that this video can be a little bit triggering for people, so if you do need to step out, it's okay to do that. It's about 3 minutes long, so please feel free if you're not sure about it. It's no problem. It's also available online, so if you'd rather watch it, in your own home, that's okay. So video 1, please.
Je suis ma grand-mère.
I am my mother.
Je suis ma sœur.
I am my auntie.
Another sœur.
I am my daughter.
I am my wife.
I am my best friend.
We are the families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited and trans people.
We are the voices of our lost loved ones who are calling out to be found.
And we echo their cries for justice.
We shed tears.
We shed tears for our sisters.
Nous sommes restés en arrière
to tell their stories.
pour partager la vérité.
Our ancestors protected our ways so we could survive and persevere.
Our relationship with Canada was created in peace,
friendship, and trust.
la paix, l'amitié et la confiance.
Promising prosperity,
Abundance and well-being.
La confiance brisée a érodé.
broken trust has eroded this relationship.
Jeopardizing what we hold most sacred.
Our women and girls,
Nos femmes et nos filles.
We are here to restore their dignity.
And forge a path for change.
Our children are our future.
We must protect them.
Nous devons les protéger.
We ask all Canadians
To stay with us.
to stand with us.
In ending all forms of violence.
learn about the truthful
La vraie histoire
of the relationship
Between First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people and Canada.
Honor that truth by upholding their rights.
by upholding their rights
and respecting our sisters.
et en respectant leurs valeurs, our language, our treaties, and our way of life with clean water, housing, and safety.
And respecting our women, our children, and our families.
Donner vie à la vérité en devenant des alliés.
By becoming allies and advocating for change needed.
job.
Good job.
Thank you so much.
Taken, not forgotten.
Taken, not forgotten. I am here to speak for those who cannot speak. Our women and girls are sacred.
Our women and girls are sacred.
I'm here for justice.
I am a change maker. Are you?
J'initie le changement. Et vous? I am a change maker. Are you?
I'm just rebooting my notes, and I also always need to take a second after that video because I do find it really hard, but also really inspiring. You know, those family members did so much work. You know, they traveled with us, they counseled us, they, you know, hugged us when we needed a hug, even though they were already carrying so much. And so I really do like to play that because I think it's important to recenter the work with the people who are still carrying a lot of the load. And so thank you for indulging me with that one. And so the National Inquiry had a truth-gathering process, and there were many people that helped us in that work, including the family members. We did hear from almost 1,500 family members and survivors who provided testimony. We also heard from over 819 people who provided artistic expressions. And the National Inquiry was the first inquiry ever to accept artistic expressions as evidence. And so we have this really wonderful, beautiful archive called the Legacy Archive that's filled with poems and songs and paintings and drawings and beading and beautiful, amazing things that make it clear that the story of MMIWG really does go beyond numbers and it goes beyond statistics. We also heard from 83 different experts, knowledge keepers, and officials who provided testimony from different services and institutions, also some scholars in there, quite a few of those folks. The National Inquiry held 15 community hearings and also 9 knowledge keeper, expert, and institutional hearings. And then also, after I arrived in 2018, I noted that there was a real lack of testimony from key groups and a real lack of kind of distinctions-based considerations. And so we started a guided dialogue process, and we held 4 different guided dialogues across the country, one for 2S LGBTQI plus people, one for Métis, one for Inuit, and one for Francophone First Nations. And so we wanted to hear from people a bit more specifically in those guided dialogues, brought together family members, survivors, frontline workers, and different experts to have a conversation in tables kind of like this one, in rooms kind of like this one, to talk about what needed to happen next. And so all of that together came to create the report. And so the report, which is called Reclaiming Power in Place, identifies 4 root causes that sustain colonial violence, and it's informed by the testimonies of nearly 3,000 survivors and family members. It's really important, and I know I keep saying family members and survivors, but to keep saying that because it's really important to note that the report that we produced wasn't a technical report by people unconnected to the issue. It wasn't a report by people who've never been on the ground. It was a report that was inspired by and led by the stories of the people who came forward to share them with us. And so in that work, we identified 4 root causes that maintain colonial violence. And that's really the interesting thing about the inquiry, was that often you have these inquiries and commissions in a time of post-atrocity, except in this case, we were still in it, and we are still in it. And so the 4 root causes that we identified were the following. So the first was unresolved multi-generational and intergenerational trauma. There was not one story that I heard over almost 3,000 stories that didn't have some element of intergenerational or multi-generational trauma. It didn't matter if the person was from a small community, an urban center, if they were from the north or from the south, if they were young or old, if they were First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, wherever they were, whoever they were, every single story had previous generations who had been targeted by different systems, whether it was residential schools or hostels, the 60s scoop, forced sterilization, forced removal, CFS today, all kinds, all kinds of things, but every story had that. It was like a common thread, and as distinctive as all the stories were, this was a real common thread. The second root cause that we identified is economic and social marginalization. And in that, I really want to emphasize the fact that marginalization is not kind of an accidental process. We often talk about marginalization as like really passive, like people are marginalized, like oops, but it's never an oops. It's not, you're never marginalized by accident, and you're always targeted. And so when we say economic and social marginalization, probably more apt to say active marginalization or targeting. The third, and to add to that, I think that was really illustrated by people that talked about, for example, being forced into unsafe situations, being forced to live in places that they didn't feel safe, being forced to travel for work in an unsafe way because there was no options for them to live close to where they worked. All of those kinds of things that maybe you don't think about unless you're living it, but that kind of are part of it, right, were some of the substance of what we heard there. The third root cause was lack of political will in maintaining the status quo. I'm a historian, so I was really interested in the archives, and if you go into the archives, you'll see a very long history of people acknowledging a problem and choosing not to fix the problem. And so historically, this is very true in the case of many reports around residential schools and other institutions, but a lack of political will in maintaining the status quo is still very much something that we need to be keen to, because when somebody says they can't, it's just often that they won't. And then the fourth root cause that I want to emphasize was the denial of the agency and expertise of Indigenous women and to us LGBTQI+ people. I can't tell you how many programs, initiatives, really amazing things we heard about that people were doing that were only funded for like a year, or that didn't have sustainable support for them to keep doing work that they knew was saving lives. They didn't have data, and so they didn't have support. And so that was a really important thing to note, is that people came forward with some really innovative, really distinctions-based, really amazing community-based, community-informed, trauma-informed things that they were doing. And they just couldn't sustain them over multiple years, and so, those things dropped off. I think that one of the things that's really hard about inquiries is building accountability. The truth is, and it's a hard truth, is that they're really not designed to support accountability. They are a mechanism through which the state archives itself, always, right? They're commissioned, usually by states, as a story about something. And so for us at the Inquiry, it was really important to try to maintain our independence, but also to try to figure out how you can make a process that's inherently not accountable, right? And so one of the things that we did was to think about what are some of the commitments that Canada has already made that they are not currently upholding or honoring. And so to that, and even though not a perfect system, we did look to domestic and international human rights instruments to say that everybody has a right to be safe. And Canada has said that it supports the right of every person to be safe, right? Everybody has the right not to be subjected to genocide, and Canada has said that it doesn't do genocide. And so we identified essentially all of these different conventions and all of these different instruments, and we identified how the stories that people shared with us demonstrated a violation of those conventions. So we looked at the Convention on Genocide, we looked at the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, we looked at the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and so all of these different kind of instruments that have made their way into domestic law in some way or another that say that Canada is going to do these things, that publicly pledge that Canada is going to do these things, and we identified the way in which that wasn't happening. Essentially, the Prime Minister in 2019 came to the ceremony on June 3rd, and then on June 4th made this statement. He said, "We thank them for their work, we applaud their work, and we accept their findings, including that what happened amounts to genocide. There are many debates ongoing around words and use of words. Our focus as a country, as leaders, as citizens, must be on the steps we take to put an end to this situation." Indeed, the finding of genocide was probably one of the most explosive things that we did, and it did draw the attention that we hoped it would draw. It was very deliberate. It was not accidental that we wanted to call attention of the international community to this issue. We wanted for the UN and the Organization of American States and all of those other folks that have an interest in this to hold Canada to account for the stories that we tell about ourselves, right? I think one of the really important things that we can kind of take away is that there is a story that exists in the world that Canada does like to tell about itself. And we need to continue to call attention to the ways in which sometimes that story does not jive. And it especially doesn't jive for Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQI+ people. And so that was what we were trying to do. Despite having a legal scholar, a renowned legal scholar, conduct an analysis of our use of the term genocide, despite some really careful research and elaboration of how we were applying the term through a sociological and historical lens, there are many who accused us of not knowing what we were talking about, of not doing the right thing. And we maintain that if you look at the record, and if you look at the Convention of Genocide, which is there on the PowerPoint, that I could name to you many examples in every single category of this convention. So the first subclause of this convention is killing members of the group. I think that one kind of speaks for itself. So the extent to which state agencies have done this is what's in question here. The second is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. I think that one also you can probably relate if you have experience in the subject, or lived experience especially. The third, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I think there we need to look at underdevelopment in communities. We need to look at lack of resources, and that's some of the examples that we had identified in the existing work. So I'm not saying anything new. This is out there. And then the fourth thing, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And so we've heard around forced sterilization and other such measures that are still done today in different ways. And then finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, which, again, we know, especially in Manitoba, that that is a major issue. We understood that as an inquiry, we are not an adjudicatory body. We're not a court. We can't find anyone guilty. What we could do is to illustrate the ways in which we believe that the stories that we heard from family members and survivors conformed to this. There are lots of people that continue to deny this work. And one of the things that I like to cite is Jessie Wente, who said, "Your discomfort does not eliminate our truth." And I think that's really important to say. The violence that the National Inquiry heard about does amount to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which especially targets Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQI+ people. This is what we said in the report. We also talked about how the genocide has been enabled by colonialist structures, many of which are still in place today. So where does this leave us? You know, I focused a lot on the things that we heard about, but I didn't yet talk about the other side of things that we heard about, which is no less important to talk about, which is this idea that our women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people are sacred. In every story that family members shared, they didn't start with what happened to their loved ones. They started by talking about their loved ones. They started talking about the special place that that person had. I heard about a person named Michelle who put notes in her little brother's lunch every day and who made a big deal out of his birthday every year. And Michelle was killed. Sorry. I heard about another lady who had a laugh so big that it could fill a whole room, and who always had tea on, and who always would have people that could come into her home if they needed a safe place to go. And so these are the people behind the numbers. These are the people that we heard about. And it's really important to not lose sight of the people behind all of this, of the fact that when people talked about how their loved one was targeted, what they really wanted to talk about, what was missing, right? What had been taken from them. And that is really, really important, because if you think about the people in your life and what they bring to your life, right? Like, I have a daughter and she's 11 and she's kind of a weirdo, and I love that about her. She's a weird little kid, right? She's a strange little person, and I love it so much. I love it so much because she makes me laugh. And I always think, you know what, you're such a little weird person, but you're gonna be fine, because she doesn't care what people think, and she'll just be weird and be who she is, and it's fine, right? And I think, what if Annabelle wasn't there? And what if I didn't have that weird little person to do weird little things and to make me laugh all of the time, right? And so if you think about that, if you think about not just the number of people or the circumstances under which they were targeted, but who they were, what they brought, what's missing, then this notion that our women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people are sacred is really, really important. Ultimately, what we found in the report through all of these situations, the good ones and the bad ones, the good stories about somebody's laugh or the tea on their stove, or the bad stories about how they were targeted or how they called for help, help never came, or how they were let out in the middle of the night from a hospital with nowhere to go. All of these stories featured a series of encounters, an encounter with a person, with an idea, with an institution, with a system that led people toward harm or toward healing. And in the cases that we heard about, it was usually toward harm. But it was important to think about that series of moments and to say, what would have happened if somebody called for help and help had come? What would have happened if the person who went to go report their child missing had had their report taken seriously and people started looking right away? What would have happened if the person wasn't released from the hospital in the middle of the night with no money or nowhere to go? And so these encounters were really important to keep in mind, because we can often think about, it's really easy to think about statistics and systems, right? It's really easy to think about how big this is and how hard it is to tackle, right? It seems bigger than we are. But if we break it down, if we think about the stories that people shared, and if we think about what is everyone's place in this work, how can, for sure, governments restructure their encounters with people? How can institutions change their encounters with people? And how can everybody who is there, people make up these places? They're not just disembodied ideas that sort of float around. People do these things, right? So how can people change these encounters? How can we take the things that have harmed people and the things that have targeted people, and how can we change them around to make them healing encounters? How can we support the safety of people in our interactions, whether we're the people that kind of answer the phone or whether we're the people that are making the laws? How can we better support, and how can we make a transformative space for encounter that supports safety for all Indigenous women and girls. So I want to now introduce you to a second group of people. So we had our elder open up the ceremony, and we had some drummers. And what I really appreciated about that was that it reminded me very much of our grandmothers and knowledge keepers from the National Inquiry. And so you've had a chance to kind of encounter some of the family members, and now I would like to introduce you to some of the leaders who really walked with us and led us on this journey. So again, if you do want to step out, maybe just wait a second and give people a second to do that if they want to. But we're just going to play one more video.
We are the Grandmother's Circle.
Nous sommes le cercle des grands-mères.
We are the Grandmother's Circle
of Canada's
historic First National Inquiry.
We are carriers of traditional knowledge. Our role is to provide teachings and guidance.
We have witnessed the process of the National Inquiry and borne witness to the family members and survivors who have testified.
We honor the tremendous courage of the Indigenous families and survivors who have shared their difficult stories with us.
As grandmothers and elders from many nations, we have clearly heard from the families, survivors, two-spirited and trans people that the violence must stop.
That the violence must stop.
That the violence must stop.
Nous croyons en la force et en la puissance de nos femmes, de nos filles et de nos personnes bispirituelles et transgenres autochtones.
Since the beginning of European contact, we have experienced the full impact of colonial violence.
This targeting genocide of our women, girls, two-spirited, and trans people is criminal.
Canada must be accountable for its inaction that has led to ongoing violence.
Our ancestors had a beautiful vision of what Canada could be.
Nations and peoples living side by side in peace and prosperity.
That vision is still waiting to be realized.
We are the people of the land. We have a responsibility to protect the land as the land protects us.
La terre nous donne la vie, tout comme nos femmes.
We want Canada to know that our women are the heart and home fires of our nations.
For the Inuit, the kunlik is that home fire which sustains our land.
Women are the life givers as well as the warriors, fighting to keep our women and children safe.
We are the Red Women Rising. Our Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited and trans people are sacred, valued, loved, and missed. They matter.
Elles sont importantes.
They matter.
Tabuna kiglisinam nikut kanadami tokotau simayu nuibo iksinaktau jayum nesiki.
We are all responsible to our children now and for the children still to come.
We challenge all Canadians to read the National Inquiry's final report.
Because we all have a responsibility to act.
C'est un projet pour un Canada nouveau.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
This is a vision for a new Canada.
So I really miss those women for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons that I miss them so much is that, you know, when we were working in this really difficult stuff, they would always try to find ways to, you know, bring people together, right? And so we had songs that we would sing together, and we would get together, and there was one of the grandmothers that you saw that would like to play pranks on people. So she used to take like knives from hotels and put them in your luggage, so you'd get to the airport, and then you'd have to unpack your bag because you had like a bunch of forks or knives randomly in your stuff. I mean, it was a family, right? That's what it was. And so, again, it's really important to center those voices. So, I mean, turning to what's going on now and reflecting on recent events. In April of this year, Statistics Canada put out a new study, and it's based on data collected in 2018. But it did say that things are not necessarily getting better. And so essentially, violent victimization comparatively for Indigenous and non-Indigenous women, there's still a rather large discrepancy from those rates. And so the red column that you see in my graphic, and I'm not a quantitative scholar, so this is very advanced data plotting for me. I don't do graphs. Is the Indigenous women, and orange is non-Indigenous women. And so you will see that there was some really interesting findings, but probably not super surprising. The other thing that was really interesting about this study, and I've become quite passionate about data, because what I've come to learn in the past 3 years is that governments don't do very much without data to support the decision. And so I'm getting into this. This is my new field. But it's really interesting to learn that there was actually quite a significant correlation between experiences of victimization and experience in care. So what they did was they took data around how many people have been in care, and they took data around violent victimization, and they did some kind of analysis that I don't understand, and they came up with a correlation that says that if you're Indigenous and if you've been in care, there's a much stronger chance that you have been or you will be victimized at some point in your life. And I think that that is really, really significant, because it's what people know, but now there's data to support it. And so data is really, really important. We also know that during COVID-19, there's been some really increased rates of violence and some increased threats. And so thinking about recent events means thinking about what has happened and what has still to happen. I think, pardon me, I think it wouldn't be fair to say nothing has happened. There's been some progress on birth alerts, even though I think they probably still occur in a different way, but probably less. Birth alerts have been officially ended in Manitoba and many other provinces. For the first time, the 2021 census collected data on 2S LGBTQIA+ folks, which is really important because people are often rendered very invisible through data. And if you can't be counted, then you can't make a case for services. And so that, I think, is actually kind of those things that seem not very important that will become very important at some point. Budget 2021 did make some historic investments, and the UN Human Rights Office and the Organization of American States are pushing for a full investigation into the finding of genocide. In addition, work by family members and survivors is continuing through the National Family and Survivors Circle. So I think stuff has happened, but I also think there's lots of work that still needs to happen. And so one of the challenges that family members have given to us and to everybody is to think about how we can be change makers. And when I think about what I can do, sometimes it's this stuff, right? It's going around and talking about this issue, and it's bringing forward the voices of different people. It's also sharing ideas about what needs to happen next. But I think fundamentally, we also need to reconsider not just the calls for justice, but the principles that are supposed to inform the implementation of the calls for justice. In the final report, we had 231 calls for justice, and people often focus on the content of the calls, but they much less think about the principles that are supposed to undergird the implementation of every single call. This includes a focus on substantive equality and human rights. It means that not everybody needs the same thing, and we need to do extra for some folks than for others. It also includes including families and survivors and being led by those voices and those solutions. Indigenous-led solutions and services. Distinctions-based solutions and services, understanding that these pan-indigenized solutions are not really helping anymore, and they never have. And finally, thinking about what it looks to do things in a trauma-informed way, as we often hear in community, in a good way, is a really important component of the work forward. I'm working on a new project, kind of off the side of my desk. I'm not an institutional academic, so all the research I do is kind of just, it's nice. I can kind of do the research I want to do, but it's also not nice because I just do it when I have time, and sometimes I have less time. So this is taking a really long time, my research, but what I'm really interested in is this idea that when I talk to lots of knowledge speakers and knowledge keepers, they'll tell me that there's no word in their language for reconciliation. And I think that this is a really interesting idea because of the way that reconciliation has been kind of mobilized by governments to say that they're doing a lot of different things. And so I think this idea about reconciliation has come to be kind of commodified, right? In a way that can be uncomfortable and not that helpful. And so to Jacqueline's point around land acknowledgement, to lots of the things that people might deem to be kind of performative acts, I think like in the spirit of reconciliation, I think it's really important to kind of break that down and to say, what does this actually mean for Indigenous people? What does reconciliation look like in Cree? What does it look like in Anishinaabe-Moan? What does it look like in Michif? What does it look like in Inuktitut? And if we do that, I think that we might come up with some really interesting solutions. I am not a fluent speaker at all. That's why I don't try to say anything to you, because even if it's your language, you will not understand what I'm saying, I promise. But I am really lucky that a lot of people do share things with me. So one of the interviews that I did recently was with a person who is learning Michif. And I had said, I would like to interview you, and here's what I would like to ask about. And they went and they talked to their language teacher about this issue. And they said, is there a word in Michif for reconciliation? And the person that they talked to said that long before there was a name for this, people were doing it already in the Métis communities. And what reconciliation kind of looks like in Métis communities is a concept that I'm not going to try to say because no one will understand it, but it means that we lift each other up. And it's an action. It's not a noun. And I think that's really important because when you talk to language speakers and language keepers, they'll often tell you that, or a lot of Indigenous languages are kind of verb-based, not noun-based. And they'll often tell you that there's something in their language, but it's always an action, and it's never just a static thing. And I think this idea of we lift each other up is just like the best thing I've ever heard. Like if I had to give content and meaning to reconciliation, it would be we lift each other up. And so as this interview went on, we talked about it, and I said, like, so what does it look like to lift each other up? When is this ever done? Or is it just, an ongoing? And the interviewee said, well, it's ongoing. And he said, honestly, he said, when I think about this and I think about where I live and how people are doing, he said, why would I accept anything less than what I had? And I also thought that that was a really important thing to say. So in closing, I want to just say that I think that it's important that as we go forward, we do the action, we lift each other up, and we continue to share ideas, and that we keep in mind that changing these encounters, transformative change, is actually millions of very small changes, right? Everywhere. You don't build a movement from a government, right? And you don't build a movement through one person. You need a lot of people doing a lot of things, right? And MMIWG and creating safety for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people should be a movement. And in that movement, I think that everybody has a place. Everybody can be a change maker. So no matter what you do or where you're coming from, and I know you're all here because you're really interested in this, then I just kind of encourage you also to think about and to continue to do the good work you're doing, to be change makers where you are, and to continue to try to hold governments accountable for what they are or are not doing, to consider how we can make these spaces safe for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people, how we can continue to be led by family members and survivors, the real experts in all of this, right? And how we can start to give meaning to reconciliation, really, to lift each other up. Jimmy Gretsch, thank you very much.